Hey there everyone, so today I want to do a lecture on Felix Guattari's Becoming Woman. This is an essay you can find in this volume, Hatred of Capitalism, published by Semiotext, edited by Kraus and Sylvere Lotringer. This is an awesome volume. If you haven't checked it out, you can tell how much I love it from all the flags. But it's a really wonderful work for exposing you to a lot of French theory, critical theory, just very interesting authors who are kind of radical and pushing bounds. But this essay of Guattari's Becoming Woman, I think, is super awesome for understanding desire as it exists in the philosophy of both Deleuze and Guattari. And in this essay, we see a lot of responses to gender and sexuality that are very similar to Judith Butler's, precisely because, of course, Butler is very influenced by the work of Deleuze and Guattari. And in this essay, Guattari is basically coming up with a micropolitics of desire. And there's a lot of terminology that's featured in both Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy that I think often makes them a lot more difficult to understand than they actually are. Once you understand the terminology, I think it's actually rather helpful for understanding the phenomena that they're talking about. But I think it's important to gain some grounding on some important concepts. And I've done lectures on every single chapter of 1,000 Plateaus on my channel, so you might want to check that out if you're more concerned about becoming animal, becoming imperceptible, becoming woman, whatever it may be. But Deleuze and Guattari are really trying to figure out, how do things become expressive? How do they come about? They do this in a number of manners. For example, they talk about the territorial behavior of animals. So how is it that a dog peeing around a certain perimeter is a territorial behavior and represents, oh, this is my territory? Because oftentimes, dogs will just pee normally and it's not a territorial behavior at all. So, for example, they will look at the territorial behavior of animals to figure out, how does the expressivity of that act come about? And in the same way, Guattari is looking at sexuality here, and he's trying to figure out, okay, how does not only heterosexuality become normalized, but how does homosexuality become relegated to a sort of background factor, a sort of secondary factor of sorts? He says that despite the intervention of groupings of a more or less corporatist nature like Arcadia, homosexuality continues to be tied to the values and interactional systems of the dominant sexuality. Its dependence in regard to the heterosexual norm is manifested in a politics of the secret, a hiddenness nourished by repression as well as by a feeling of shame still lively in respectable milieus. It enforces a second-degree norm, no longer moral but scientific. Homosexuality is no longer a moral matter, but a matter of perversion. Psychoanalysis makes an illness of it, a developmental retardation, a fixation at the pregenital stage, etc. So Guattari is pointing out that even in an era in which homosexuality has become more normalized, still, it is relegated to a secondary phenomena, and often, especially in France, for example, it was treated as a sort of mental retardation. And we see this even in French laws, for example, where the age of consent for heterosexuals was 15. But if you were homosexual, it was 18. So homosexuality was thought to impact your mental capacities to the extent that they needed to raise your age of consent such that you'd have more time to mature or something like this. So as a result, homosexuality starts to become normalized, but in the mode of the secret. It's something, that like businessmen have to hide, that they get it on with another guy after working hours or something like this. So there are still these vestiges of homosexuality being relegated to the secret, to a secondary phenomena, being derived from heterosexuality, such that heterosexuality is still considered to be the norm. And one of the things that Guattari is trying to get away from is viewing sexuality in this binaristic nature. He writes, I think it's important to destroy big notions like woman, homosexual. Things are never that simple. When they're reduced to black-white, male-female categories, there's an ulterior motive, a binary reductionist operation meant to subjugate them. For example, you cannot qualify a love univocally. Love in Proust is never specifically homosexual. It always has a schizoid, paranoid component, a becoming animal, a becoming woman, a becoming music. So at the heart of these categories of sexuality, Guattari is trying to show how they themselves engage in a becoming. And the philosophy of becoming is not new. It was featured prominently in the Hegelianism that was so popular with like Hocquengem at the time that Guattari is writing. And indeed, Foucault and Deleuze were both educated in a philosophical system built around Hegelianism. But the problem with the way Hegelianism saw becoming is that there were basically good and bad becomings. As contradictions get sublated in, Hegel's philosophy of history, for example, we have world historical persons who act at these historical breaks and basically bring forth the next historical development and sublate the previous moments of history and lead us to something new, such that, history is constantly engaged in this becoming, which is led by reason for Hegel with the capital R. And that notion of reason is that subtle little engineered, as he calls it, binary reductionism that acts behind, for example, the becoming of sexuality as it is dominated in this binary heterosexual, homosexual relationship. And Guattari is well aware that we are going to be looking, as he says, it could be said at the same time that all forms of sexuality, all forms of sexual activity are fundamentally on the side of the personological homo-hetero oppositions. So he understands that this heterosexual-homosexual matrix is a way of understanding our sexuality. And it's not something that should be ignored because it in fact is a way that we understand the way we work. And what it equally points out is the way that this heterosexual matrix works. It shows how certain forms of sexuality, or more specifically desire, or libido, in the Freudian sense, are elevated among or above others. And as such, Guattari wants to look at this role that the sort of secondary, as it is called in the Thousand Plateaus, minoritarian forms of sexual expression might have a special power insofar as they can act on a number of different registers. And this is something that Guattari points out fairly regularly in this essay, is that majoritarian, or, these masculine, phallic sort of ways of expressing your sexuality, of being dominant, of being owed an orgasm, for example, that these are generally a little bit more set in stone, a little bit more clear than are the more minoritarian forms of sexuality. This is the stuff that doesn't quite fit into the dominant categories, and as such, it gets relegated to something secondary. He writes, "The becoming woman serves as a point of reference and eventually as a screen for other types of becoming." Now, what does he mean by this? Because this is, he uses this term becoming woman throughout, but it's a little bit of a difficult term to get around. And the way we have to understand this is that the entire binary of heterosexual, homosexual, male, female, masculine, feminine, these binaries are themselves in flux. And they have to sort of justify a fixity that they don't actually have, precisely by relegating a term to something secondary, something derivative. And as such, this homosexual, heterosexual binary starts to gain legitimacy due to things like repression, due to the fact that, if you're a heterosexual, that is basically assumed. But if you're homosexual, that is something that's taboo, that you have to come out as, for example. And he writes, "The pair feminine passive, masculine active therefore remains a point of reference made obligatory by power in order to permit it to situate, localize, territorialize, control intensities of desire." So desire is always at the heart of the philosophy of both Guattari and Deleuze. And it's something that I think most people don't really pay enough attention to, which is that they are exercising a form of psychoanalysis, although it is schizoanalysis. And the point of schizoanalysis is to look at the way desire is employed in a field, the way that it is used, and the way that it flows between various points, without presupposing ways that desire must function, as was the case for Freud, for example, who presupposes the Oedipus complex as a way that desire functions in a social field. So Guattari looks at, for example, this feminine passive, masculine active binary, and says that it, in fact, acts as a point of reference which territorializes desire. So the imposition of what it means to be masculine plays itself out when one is a child, such that, someone might tell a young boy that, oh, you should like cars, or that's a little weird that you like Barbie dolls, or something like that. Such that this matrix of what it means to be masculine, or what it means to be feminine, is imposed upon a field of desire that doesn't reduce itself to these logical binaries. But these binaries impose themselves upon desire, and in so doing, act as a territorializing behavior, just like the dog who pees around the perimeter of a territory and therefore marks it off as his own. Guattari thus writes, "Deviance, various forms of marginalization, are themselves coded to work as safety values. Women, in short, are the only official trustees of a becoming sexed body. A man who detaches himself from the phallic types inherent in all powerful nations will enter such a becoming woman according to diverse possible modalities. It is only on this condition, moreover, that he will be able to become animal, cosmos, letter, color, music." And this is the height of what becoming woman means for Guattari, because basically all these marginalized positions, this could be the child, this could be the woman, this could be the immigrant, all these marginalized positions, which will be called minoritarian in Guattari's work with Deleuze in A Thousand Plateaus, these minoritarian phenomena act, as he says, as safety values. They act to basically absorb the excess that doesn't fit into the dominant categories. And by being relegated to a secret or something taboo, acts as a regulator of a system such that it can more efficiently express itself in a fairly coded way, much like a computer. But there's always these possibilities. For example, in the case of a computer, you always have the possibility of electrical failures or some sort of glitch in the code. And this glitch in a code is what it means to be woman for Guattari. And this is woman not in the sense of an absolute notion of women. Like he talked about before, he wants to destroy these big notions of woman. That there's something eternal about femininity is precisely the problem. So when he uses the word woman in this sense, he's not using it in the sense of woman has some absolute meaning, but rather seeing how women or animals or children or homosexuals, how they exist as a secondary phenomenon, and using that to point out the power of these secondary phenomena, which is that because desire cannot be effectively coded in every single possible manner, those that get relegated to these minoritarian categories have bred within them a deviancy that cannot be coded. A whole micropolitics of desire opens up here, where desire can be used in all sorts of ways. And in fact, this doesn't serve to bolster the fixity of the masculine, for example, or the phallic. But what this does is, by looking at the way these dominant categories basically let off steam, it shows the holes within these majoritarian categories themselves. It shows how they fail to adequately code all of desire, and in so doing, their impotence becomes their undoing. Now, the notion of territory is something which, in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, often gets misunderstood, because you may read some of their philosophy and they constantly talk about the body without organs, and they have a whole chapter in A Thousand Plateaus called How Do You Make Yourself a Body Without Organs? And if you read some of Artaud's work, for example, it may seem like they are trying to go to some terrible extreme at which we get rid of all possible identity. We just exist in some liminal state at which nothing is defined. And this is simply not what Guattari or Deleuze or Artaud are trying to say. We can see this in the quote here by Guattari. In a more general way, every dissident organization of libido, which is to say desire, must therefore be directly linked to a becoming feminine body as an escape route from the repressive socius, as a possible access to a minimum of sexed becoming, and as the last buoy vis-a-vis the established order. And that notion of a buoy really undergirds and explicates really well what is meant by territory and how identity is treated in the philosophy of Guattari and Deleuze. Territory is always there, which is to say, behaviors have a definition of sorts. I know what is expected of me as a man, and women watching this know what is expected of them as a woman. It's not like these notions of masculine and feminine, by being constructs that therefore entails that they have no definition. No, in fact, their definitions, they are performative concepts that we live, that we explicate through our actions and become part of what it means to be an individual. But at the heart of this is the fractured I that Deleuze talks about in Difference and Repetition, which is to say, this notion of a self-identity, for example, is actually a whole 1,001 selves, as Deleuze calls it, no doubt in reference to the 1,001 Nights, in which this assumed fixity of self-identity is in fact a whole number of micro phenomena that are sort of being congealed into a stable category. But just like in the case, Guattari loves talking about molecular politics. Just like with molecules, at the fundamental molecular level, they portray Brownian motion, for example. If you look at a molecule, it sort of does this random sort of shaking around, and it just kind of bustles about, because this is just a fundamental property that molecules and particles and atoms have, is that they just have this chaos bred within them. And this sort of, gets overwritten when you get to this book is made up of a number of molecules, but it seems fairly fixed, it seems fairly stable. But just in the way that something on the macro level like this book appears fixed, whereas on the molecular level, it is bred with this motion and variation, so too does Guattari want to understand desire and sexuality and identity in this way, in which territorial behaviors, which in the case of sexuality would be, ways of being feminine or being masculine, these act as sort of signposts or points of reference, as he calls them, or buoys, and acts as a way that we can situate ourselves in a social field. But by maintaining a minimum of sexed difference, or minimum of sexed becoming, as Guattari says, we can effectively understand the majority, which would be the masculine, the male, the phallic, the heterosexual. We can understand these categories as themselves beholden to the secondary category, which is to say the woman. This is what becoming woman is. It is not talking about these secondary minoritarian categories. In fact, becoming woman is the constitutive factor of the majority, of the masculine, of the male, of the heterosexual. The becoming woman is that behavior, that flow which cannot be coded, and which therefore spills out of the box, so to speak, and therefore acts as a creative possibility in which one can become animal, become cosmos, become letter, become color, become music, as he's talked about. So there are all sorts of creative ways of using one's identity that doesn't reduce to these majority categories. And we hear this best in this quote here from Guattari. I emphasize this last point because the becoming feminine body shouldn't be thought of as belonging to the woman category found in the couple, the family, etc. Such a category only exists in a specific field that defines it. That would be a milieu, for example, or an assemblage. There is no such thing as woman per se, no maternal pole, no eternal feminine. The man-woman opposition serves as a foundation to the social order before class and caste conflicts intervene. Conversely, whatever shatters norms, whatever breaks from the established order, is related to homosexuality or to becoming animal or a becoming woman, etc. Every semiotization in rupture implies a sexualization in rupture. Thus, to my mind, we shouldn't ask which writers are homosexual, but rather what it is about a great writer, even if he is in fact heterosexual, that is homosexual. So once again, Guattari is using animal or homosexual or woman precisely insofar as they function as repressed terms in a social order. And this notion of heterosexuality, for example, or the man-woman opposition, serves as a foundation. But of course, this is a foundation that doesn't exist objectively. It only exists as it functions by repressing, for example, as it exists by relegating that which cannot be totalized to the sidelines, to something, infantile, to something derogatory. But this notion of a semiotization in rupture, this is basically a field, a social field, a system of signs, of coded behaviors. When that is in rupture, that implies a sexualization in rupture. And thus vice versa. So a sexual behavior which defies this system of coded behaviors itself has a profound impact on a field of behaviors, right? It changes the way we interact with each other and therefore changes where exactly heterosexuality is located in a social field. So therefore, breaking norms is the becoming woman, the becoming animal of the social order itself. It is the spilling forth that cannot help but take place in a social order and which testifies to the possibilities of creative action therein. So I hope this has been helpful for understanding the philosophy of Guattari and Deleuze. This, of course, is very helpful for understanding Hocquengem, for example, and Judith Butler. Check out this volume if you never have. It's absolutely awesome, and you'll be exposed to so much cool theory. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month, and I do a monthly private philosophy Zoom. That's it, and I'll see you in another lecture.